Hello, dear listeners.
Welcome to the first episode.
And possibly the last if I fail to overcome my hatred of my own recorded voice.
Of Cork Out History.
Where we drink Portuguese wine.
And we talk about Portuguese history.
Mostly the wine.
My name is André.
And I'm Inês.
And welcome to Cork Out History.
This is the first podcast for either of us.
Yeah, so excuses for any problems we might have on this first one.
There are some podcasts about Portuguese history, but we feel like there's still space for us to make our take on it. And especially in English, there's definitely not much available about our country, is there?
Yeah, I think we forgot to mention, but we're both from Portugal.
And because it's lockdown, even though we both live in London, we're still seeing each other through a screen.
And what are we drinking tonight, Inês?
We're drinking the easiest one for us to find, apparently, which is called Portucale, which means door number 6.
So this is a wine from Lisbon, and it's one we've tried before. I think it's you who told me about it, actually.
Yeah, I remember I mentioned it because I remember thinking that the label was actually pretty cute. The label and the cork, because like any proper Portuguese wine, this wine doesn't have the screw-on tops, but a cork, like it should. If anyone from Portugal is hearing us at the moment, they will realize that they are not familiar with the wine. That's because this wine is only for exporting, so it's not available in Portugal. I had never seen it, so I can only find it here. If that's a good thing or not, I have no idea. But I was quite pleased last time I tried it.
Yeah, this one I've tried it. It's not my favorite, I must say, but let's just say I'm a bit picky. And
you are a bit picky. You are very, very picky.
So yeah, but it's a good one, and I think we should start with this one, especially because this is being recorded during lockdown, so the options are indeed limited at the moment. So
very limited. Yeah. So basically, we are another one of those people who during lockdown started making podcasts. Yes. Did you hear that?
I heard that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Cheers.
Cheers.
Chin chin.
Chin chin. And may the first episode of Cork Out History begin. Let's get started. Where is Portugal? What is Portugal? People who've never heard anything about Portugal, they might have heard about Cristiano Ronaldo. What else would you guess people have heard about?
Maybe Madeira wine or port?
Yes, I believe they would call it Madeira wine and Madeira cake. Yeah, and port wine, yeah, definitely. And Algarve, probably, if you're in Britain, it's quite famous here. So, Andre, what is our first episode about?
When you first invited me, because yes, Inês was the one that invited me to start this podcast, it was really tough to decide on where we would start, because where's the beginning? That was the first question. How we're gonna do this? So we decided that the best place to start would probably be the beginning. Which beginning? Now. Follow Inês. Tell me. Guide me through it. How did we get to this beginning?
Eventually, we decided that if this was to be about Portuguese history, we might as well begin with the foundation of Portugal. It's not, obviously there are things before that. Obviously there are loads of things after that. But, okay, fine. Let's start with the foundation of the country, if not the territory, because obviously the place was there before. So that might sound like now we know where we're starting, but that's not true at all. When we tried to start talking about the foundation of Portugal, we realized by the time I caught myself, I was around, 700 years before the actual treaty and everything got approved. So I feel like 7 centuries before is a little bit of a stretch to go. So we've cut it a little bit at the start, but I believe we've tackled just enough for this to make as much sense as possible and as much sense as we can both make of it.
One thing that is important to mention straight away is that neither me nor Inês are historians. I did study history in university, but I think we'll try to be critical of our sources and of where we get the information. But this is, of course, a personal view on things.
It's our personal take on things, kinda. So basically, we're doing this for fun. Andre did a bachelor and master's in history. I did nothing of the sort. I studied fashion, actually, so that's quite a bit of a stretch there. I guess I really dig history, though. And I listen to a lot of podcasts. And then, ta-da-da, here we are, trying to do our own Portuguese history podcast. And this has all to be taken with a grain of salt. One thing that I think we are both interested in is to
rethink a few things that we've been told or question a bit further into.
Or take a second look at some of the things that we were taught in school and how we were presented with history, which can always be revisited, and it depends obviously a lot on who's studying it.
Right, so we were saying before, Inês, you were saying actually that when trying to get to the beginning, you went a bit further back and you crossed paths with things like the Visigoth occupation of the Peninsula and then the Mourish occupation, right?
Yeah, so basically when I caught myself, I was starting with the end of the Roman Empire, or not the end, well, when the Roman Empire lost its hold in the Iberian Peninsula, which obviously...
And when was that?
Around the 5th century. Don't get me started. Don't get me to go all that far back. But anyway.
No, I don't want you to. I just want to give some dates so that people have an idea of where we are in terms of time.
I think the Roman Empire is a good reference point to ensure we all know where in time we stand. It was such a crucial, colossal period in Western history which changed the world forevermore that I think it will probably ring some bells on anyone listening to this podcast, regardless where you come from. Do you reckon this is a Western bias?
It might be. I'm not sure. That's a good question, but I don't know. I don't know.
I feel like I could read a whole list of synonyms of the word important and still not overstate how significant and far-reaching in its influence the Roman Empire was. Which is exactly why we will talk about it in another season and dedicate a bunch of episodes to it at some point. Let us just say that Portugal, or to be more accurate, the territory which would become Portugal, was part of the Roman Empire until the 5th century. Time when the Roman Empire of the West disintegrated. And I say of the West because during the 14th century AD, the Roman Empire was struggling to maintain such a vast empire that they decided to split it in half. So basically there was the Roman Empire of the West and the East. Now, in the 5th century, the Roman Empire of the West, with its capital in Rome, would be overtaken by Germanic tribes led by Alaricus, king of the Visigoths. In the east, the Roman Empire would carry on for another 9 or 10 centuries with the capital in Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, and would then be most commonly known as the Byzantine Empire. There were many things leading to this collapse of the Roman Empire of the West, but the Germanic invasions were the straw that broke the camel's back. These Germanic tribes, and what we usually call the barbaric tribes... barbarian, like... The term itself was coming from for the Romans and for the Greeks was just like anyone not being themselves. So basically, I think it starts with the Greeks, and it's just like people, everyone who wasn't Greek, they called a barbarian. Barbarian, the word, it literally came from like bar, which was like their word for gibberish. Like they talk gibberish, we don't know what the hell they're saying, and they don't talk like us. Yeah, like barbar, like blah blah blah. I have no idea what these guys are saying. Great place to start
a conversation, isn't it?
It's probably bullshit. Anyway,
let's kill them. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I had decided not to go back. Like when we started, before starting the podcast, we were actually discussing like how far to go and not to go. And we decided, okay, let's not talk about the barbarians at all. And now here we are talking about the Romans. The freaking Romans are not even in the script, okay?
I know. But okay, let's carry on. Let's not get ourselves lost in there. So from the Romans, we moved on to the...
Yeah, so then there's what we usually call the barbarian invasions, with the Germanic tribes which come from, well, from outside the peninsula, so from the north. And they for a long while, they take hold on of the peninsula. Peninsula is like... during this time, we're going to be referring a lot to the peninsula, as in the whole territory. Obviously, today the peninsula is divided between Portugal and Spain. If you don't know that, please do take a look at the map now. We're going to be extremely offended if you just refer to it as Spain or something like that. So the peninsula today, it's divided between two countries. It's...
Check your maps, go down, it's south, it's west of Europe. And we're there.
We are there.
So that's
we are there. You should come over. We have a terrific country. Very cheap, lovely beaches. Anyway.
Oh God.
Good food. Excellent wine.
This converted into a touristic. Yeah, okay. We're already selling the country and we're not even 20 minutes into the podcast.
Touristic drums.
Right, so you were saying that, yeah, that's the territory we're talking about, and that the barbaric tribes came in.
Indeed. Exactly. I was explaining why I keep mentioning the peninsula. At this time, there's still no countries there. So there's still, and for a long time, until much later, actually, when it's going to be, today's terms is Portugal and Spain. After the Visigoths take Rome, there's a shit ton of tribes moving all over Europe and taking over Roman provinces. There are 4 Germanic tribes which wreak havoc in the peninsula. The first 3 to come are the Vandals, the Alamans, and the Suevi. Out of these, the first 2 moved fairly quickly. Only the Suevi lasted longer and settled more significantly into something like a structured society, the Kingdom of the Suevi, with the capital in Braga, which had been a large Roman city and which is to this day one of the most significant cities in the north.
Here we are in our little touristy break. Another shout out to Braga then. Here we go.
Now cue the touristic drums.
Let's carry on.
It's a lovely city. Beautiful. These were very turbulent times and the land was rife with quarreling tribes and unrest. However, one thing was truly vital in seeing this absolute shitshow through: the church. The church, the religious power, was the one structure to withstand the absolute shitstorm. Not only to withstand it, but to become absolutely critical, instrumental in structuring the future to this day. The Catholic Church had been deeply ingrained in the peninsular Roman culture, structuring the society and land around it. It was able to take the Suevi in its stride and absorb them, so to speak, and this pagan tribe converted to Christianism. This was really only the beginning of the insane amount of power and importance that the church would hold in the future.
So Rome had a complicated relationship with the Visigoths, as they turned from enemies raiding Rome to allies of some sort. But in 1416, the emperor sent these allies to reconquer the peninsula and rule it in alliance to Rome. Now, the Visigoths then take over the peninsula, kicking off the Vandals and Almans, which was pretty straightforward, but they struggled a bit more to get rid of the Suevi. Although, in the end, this too would come to pass, and once again religion would play a crucial role, because, you see, the Visigoths, when they come to the peninsula, they were Christian, but they were Arian Christians. Now, at this time, the peninsula was Catholic through and through. The turning point for this territory was when the Visigoths converted to Catholicism, and then the resistance the church had represented turned to support, and the invaders were accepted. This would, of course, take its time, and it would contribute to later creating what we call the Visigothic Empire, which lasted for around 200 years. So this also highlights how it wasn't only the Romans who were crucial to the formation of the Western civilization, and especially of the people that lived in that territory there, but the Visigoths too. And once again, this subject is so broad that we will definitely, hopefully, visit once again in another season later on. For now, let's just mention that during their time in power and there, a lot of the medieval social structure, which would then last centuries, was implemented and solidified. For instance, having a society that's divided into nobility, church, and pleb. This society was extremely stratified, with the Visigoths being a warrior elite which ruled over the local population. Only Visigoths could be nobles, and only nobles could carry weapons, for instance, and that tends to set things pretty quickly.
Yeah, tends to be that way.
This warrior elite didn't care that much for intellectual or cultural affairs, and those were left in the hands of the church, which then had a huge impact on the life and society and in everything that had to do with administration of the land. For instance, the division of the own land and even the organization into the days of the week that we still use today.
And so now we are at a point that we had decided to start our episode.
Kind of, right? I don't think we are right there, but I guess...
Well, we did say that we were going to start with the Moorish occupation, so...
Yeah, so we haven't mentioned the Moors yet, so yeah. Right, as Inez was saying, the Visigoths were there for quite some time in that land, at
200 years?
the far west of what is now Europe? No, of Europe.
It was Europe then as well.
Yeah, I know. Shut up. Don't include this. Cut this shit out. Right. I was thinking European Union, and you know it. Right. So
we're out. Okay, so the Visigoths had ruled the peninsula for about 200 years, like we've mentioned. Now, the people that come next, they will stay for a while longer.
And who are they, Inish?
Okay, so they are what usually we were told, like, and how we learned it is like they were the Moors. That's the way that we kept referring to them growing up and in school.
And that's basically the way that all European Christians referred to them at the time
exactly.
as well.
They were
right?
They were coming from the north of Africa. They were the main difference being that they were Muslim, and obviously they were other people to the people being there at the time. Let's go back to the Visigoths for a second. Their reign was far from a peaceful and steady kingdom. There was actually a lot of infighting amongst nobility. Because you see, the Visigoths traditionally elected their kings, which might sound rather modern to our sensibilities. You know, choosing who will rule according to their capabilities and all that. Sounds great. But like everything, it is a double-edged sword. It opens the way for a lot of instability as well. Strife, political games, civil war. I mean, these things take place even when you know who the next king in power is going to be. Think back to a few centuries later, medieval Europe. All those kings and queens were freaking out at not having an heir and a spare all the time. It just invites uncertainty and instability, and societies and empires do not do well with any of these things. Now, one of their kings had attempted to change the law, to turn their ruling powers to be inherited, passed from father to son, keep it in the family, keep it nice and steady, with his family in power, of course.
Of course.
Now, also this failed, divided Visigoths into two factions, and a civil war ensued. Now, here are these two sides at war, scraping for every advantage that they can get, anything that can give them the edge and tip over this war. And then, right there, across this short stretch of sea, in the coast of Africa, are the Moors. A whole army of Moors, which would most definitely easily overthrow that balance. Now, it's really not that surprising that one of the factions realized this and looked for an ally in the Moors right across the strait in the north of Africa and been like, "Hey, how about you give us a hand here?" And the Moors were like, "Sure, sure, we'll come over, no problem.
Right.
When the battle took place, the Visigoths turned on each other, and the Moorish victory was so overwhelming that it became obvious just how ridiculously unprepared the Visigoths were. No resistance whatsoever, and how easy it would be for the Moors to just keep going. And so they did. And in the next 5 years, they had taken over the whole peninsula, except for the Asturias, which is a small, extremely steep and mountainous region on the very north of the peninsula, which resisted invaders and never fell under Moorish rule. But I mean, other than this thin strip of land in the north, the rest of the peninsula was all under Moorish rule at some point, with the Moorish occupation lasting as long as 800 years in the south of present-day Spain. One thing that I never realized was that the Moorish invasion made it past the Pyrenees and into France, going as far as Poitiers, south of Paris, before being brought to a halt in the Battle of Tours against Charles Martel in 732. And I had no idea. Now, I went all out on this limb here to make clear how fluid things were between the two sides from the very start. The narrative is far from being that black and white, clean-cut, neat narrative we so often tend to go for. Yeah, just a curiosity. The point where the Moors landed in the peninsula, it was in Gibraltar. So I believe it is a British territory, from what I understand, and has weird tax laws and all that kind of stuff going on there. But anyway, it's just a strait, and it's between the north of Africa and the south of Spain. It's the shortest distance, and it's called Gibraltar today, like the name that we still use, because that's it was named something like Jibel Tarik. Tarik was the name of the chief of the first army that crossed the strait. So the first chief of the Moors, which came and conquered the peninsula, was called Tarik. And Jibel Tarik meant Tarik's rock or Tarik's mountain, where he landed. Mm-hmm. Before that, during the classical period, the strait was actually called the Pillars of Hercules. Of course. Basically it was like, yeah. So it was, it's a fun curiosity. So Gibraltar, the way we call it today, comes from Jibel Tarik. The Moor occupation of the peninsula lasted a lot longer in some areas than in others. In Portugal, the north would be occupied for around 150 years, whereas the Algarve would be occupied for 600 years. And in Spain, some areas were occupied for another 200 years after that. So Portugal, or what would become Portugal, was fully conquered by the Christians 200 years before Spain. So obviously in the Algarve and in the south, the heritage and the Arabic influences are a lot stronger, and they lasted, and we can see a lot more of it still today. I will just mention that the Muslim occupation was an absolute gem of a period, and I can't wait to revisit this in a later season. For the most part, the Moor occupation was peaceful and managed through diplomacy and treaties, with them being seen almost more as freeing invaders than oppressive ones, considering that the Visigoth rule had actually been rather dictatorial and shitty, to be fair. It was a period of surprising religious freedom and outstanding scientific and cultural achievements. Can't bloody wait to talk about it at some point. But for now, let's zoom in.
Okay, so now that we know that our start will be at the beginning of the 8th century, let's just give like a quick chronological wrap-up of what we've been looking at. So, after Viriato, which is someone that we're not going to go into right now, he's a mythical figure of the 2nd century that we will eventually talk about. Up to the 5th century, we are talking about a land that's occupied by the Roman Empire. In 409, we have the entrance of the barbarian tribes that we've talked before, so the Sueves, the Vandals, and the Alans, and the subsequent fall of the Roman Empire. 100 years later, we then see the first unification of this whole territory under Leovigildo, a Visigoth king. And his successor is the one that converts to Catholicism in 589, 589, and 589. And later on, in 711, we witnessed the first Muslim invasion of the peninsula. It's in the years and centuries that followed that, and the resistance of the Catholic kingdoms up north, and in this whole process that takes place, and that ultimately leads to the foundation of a separate Portuguese kingdom, that we're going to focus now. And we will watch rebels, political reconfigurations, and movements that will shape this piece of land.
In 722, the Christians' resistance wins the Battle of Covadonga. This was led by a leader called Pelagio. Now, we're not sure who Pelagio was. Some of the sources mention him as a Visigoth nobleman, although like some others refer to him as a local rebel. So we clearly we're not entirely sure who he was, but everyone agrees that Pelagio was the leader and that they won the Battle of Covadonga.
So this marks the beginning of a movement that will later become known as Reconquista. Reconquista is a word that basically means to conquer again, reconquer.
This idea of Reconquista is a very important. It's very defining for the early stages of the peninsula. The whole idea, the whole lens that would be Portugal and that would be Spain went through this, and this lasted several centuries, and so it's a major part of both countries' history. Now, obviously, yes, reconquest, and especially the way that we paint it or that we are thought about it in school, it could be troubling in the way that we see it, but we have to understand that, first of all, like everything, history is always seen from the point of view of the winners. And in this case, they got the land back. They didn't get the land back. The land had been under Moorish occupation for like 600 years. So it's not like getting the land back or not. But this idea of the reconquest is very close, is intertwined with the ideas, for instance, of the Crusades. Later on, what?
Intertwined. Intertwined.
Oh God. Oh mate. No, I would love to keep this. I'm not sure if people are gonna get it though. The idea of the reconquest is intertwined with the idea of the Crusades, which
is just starting in that period. Actually, it's like we have to think of it as contemporary things that are happening simultaneously, and that Portugal and well, yeah, not Portugal and Spain, but what will be Portugal and Spain becomes a territory of experimenting that first movement of crusading down against this enemy that's defined as the Moors in this case. So this battle, Covadonga battle, was later hailed as marking the beginning of the Reconquista. And at the time, however, this was more of a defensive reaction by the people of Cantabria, the region where it happened, to the more incursions on their lands, more so than any kind of organized offensive with the intent to reconquer any lands.
I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. We like to look at it as a whole story that's neatly presented, and it's not like that. Like, things are messy. Things last like hundreds of years, and obviously nothing is just as clean and neat and put together like we often want to believe. So and that's going to happen a lot with our idea of the reconquest. And as well, like, for instance, the way that we get presented to it in school and growing up, which is like, obviously, for simplicity's sake, we say that there were Christians, and then the Moors came along, and then the Christians came, and they conquered the land again, and boom, we have Portugal. Obviously, like we were mentioning before, it was not like this. And those are just the very, very, very broad strokes.
Actually, during those two first centuries of what we now look at as the Reconquest, this resistance up in the north was more often motivated by sustenance and looting of the Moorish lands below than any kind of religious belief or any kind of crusade spirit that would later develop and play a huge role in the conquest further south.
So this Pelagio, he's seen as the chief behind the beginning of the Reconquest, and he's become a little bit almost of a mythical figure. Yeah, later kings will state that they're descendants from this guy to legitimize their power. Pelagio is the origin to all the future dynasties in the western side of the peninsula. Now I say western, that's basically what would be Portugal and central Spain. There's another line around the county of Barcelona, which comes from France, the kingdom of Navarra and Aragon. Their line descends from something in the Pyrenees, and then everything else, so what you might have heard referred to, for instance, Castilla, and the kingdom of Leon, so central Spain and modern Portugal. The future dynasties all say that they are descendants of Pelagio, as, you know, the one original Christian who started the Reconquest, as he was later painted.
Right, so when we're thinking about these regions up north, there's actually one that's going to play a more important role in this podcast, and that's the region of Portugal, and that's a region a land named after Porto and Gaia. Inês, do you want to tell us a bit more about this Portucale place?
Yeah, so basically, Portucale would be what is usually referred later on as the county of Portucale. And Portucale is a region between the Rio Minho and the Rio Douro. So the county of Portucale is where the Kingdom of Portugal is going to stem from. Now, interestingly enough, or at least what I think is interesting, which, can be up for discussion, Portucale, you can perhaps see the similarity with that name already to our country's name these days, which is Portugal. So it's really not that far away. Portucale is the words of Porto and Cale put together. So Porto means a shipyard, a port, like for boats, for ships, and Cale was the Roman name of a city that we today call Gaia. So if any of you have been to Porto, Porto is in the north bank of the river Douro, and on the south bank there will be the city of Gaia. Yeah, today Porto is the biggest city of the two. In the origin, it actually meant the port of the city Gaia. So the town developed around the port of Gaia, which was later moved from the south bank, close to Gaia, to the northern bank, where today is the city of Porto.
So in 1868, Vimera Pérez, which is... who the fuck is Vimera Pérez?
Vimera Pérez is the man who basically first conquered the land of Portucale. He conquered the land in 868, if the dates are to be believed, and he was the first count of Portucale, and he founded the city of Guimarães, which is going to be important for a very long time, and it is still very important today. If anyone is listening to us from Guimarães, lovely city. The county of Portucale would be ruled by his descendants for a long while, for many generations to come. In these descendants, there are a couple of interesting people. For instance, his I'm not entirely sure how many granddaughter, was called Mumadona Dias, which is a very funky name considering for us today. But this lady was a very fierce lady. Her husband died early on, as he was the one ruling in her stead. and so she became a widow, but she kept ruling the land. She would be the one who got the Guimarães Castle built, where our first king and the royal family would live. Or at least it would be one of the main royal strongholds, since the monarch in Portugal was always quite notorious for being nomad, moving through many towns in the kingdom.
Yeah, that's something that's only going to change, not only in Portugal, but like throughout Europe. In the passage between the medieval way of ruling and the modern way of ruling, where kings tend to get more based in one place because bureaucracy also increases tremendously, so we won't see these nomad kings that we have in this period.
The zenith, what could be considered the zenith of the county, would have been under a descendant called Gonzalo Menendez. He seemed, according to the sources, he seemed to have hold at some point the name of Grand Duke of Portugal in some documents. It could have been this Count Gonzalo who assassinated one of the kings called Sancho the Fat of the Kingdom of Leon. This murder would have occurred in quite a spectacular fashion, if you want. Now, I'm going to go on a bit of a tangent here, but as it turns out, this Sancho the Fat, who was possibly assassinated by the Grand Duke, makes for quite a story. He was nicknamed the Fat, having weighted something around 240 kg. And guess what? He was arrested for it. Good old fat phobia doesn't care if you're a king. The nobles were taking the piss constantly and argued they could not be governed by someone who couldn't jump around. They went even further and questioned whether he could get frisky and whether he had consummated his marriage. And it worked. And he fucking lost his throne based on this. Then, in order to get his throne back, this guy goes to the first dietitian in history. I'm probably gonna murder his name here, but it was something like Hasdai ibn Shaprut, a Jewish physician in the Caliphate of Cordoba. And it just gets cray pretty quickly. This guy actually had his mouth stitched together in order to ensure he would take nothing but liquids through a straw. He was tied to a bed to ensure that he wasn't eating shit, and only freed to go on these long walks where he was pulled along in ropes by slaves. I have no idea how the fella actually survived this, but he managed to, and he lost weight, and he actually managed to get his throne back.
What the hell? How did you learn about this? This is horrible.
It's just one of those rabbit holes. But we don't stop here, because it's like, so he goes through all of this shit, right? All that to 6 years later be killed by a poison apple of all things. Very Snow White style. Am I meant to think that this is not a jab at a fat person? This is up for debate though. Not everyone agrees that it was our Portuguese Gonzalo. It's possible that it was some other Gonzalo living at the time, but I like to go with this one. Let's think it was the Grand Duke of Portugal who assassinated the King of Leon, Snow White style.
Okay, so Portucale, this county, lasted until 1071, when Nuno Mendes dies in the Battle of Pedroso. Who the fuck is Nuno Mendes?
Nuno Mendes is the last descendant of the Vimarapers and Mumadona Dias. And we are going to talk about the Battle of Pedroso in just a few minutes, or longer if we get carried away.
So it's after this battle that there's a 23-year interregnum where the county of Portucale ceases to exist until it is then restored in 1094 when Afonso VI gifts this county to Henry of Burgundy as a dowry of his daughter Teresa.
Which is gonna be major to our kingdom, and so we are definitely gonna focus on that in just a little bit.
And this is where we'll stop for now. Stick with us and join us in the next episode of Cork Out History in 2 weeks.
Until then, you can find us on Instagram and Facebook at Cork Out History Pod, and on Twitter at Cork Out History, where you can reach out to us, let us know your thoughts, and discover more about the upcoming episodes.
Don't forget to rate and subscribe wherever you're listening to us.
Your comments are crucial so that more people can find us.
Bye. Bye.